We are pleased to be joined by James Fallows, presidential speechwriter for Carter for several years. And so good to see you, Jim, and have you here. You not only worked with Jimmy Carter for several years, you then, of course, wrote about his presidency. And I know in one of those things you called Jimmy Carter an unlucky president, but a lucky man. How so?
So I think when he was president, all these many decades ago, so many things broke against him. The world was in terrible shape. The U.S. was in terrible shape. Almost any malady you can think of these days, we had a more intense version of then. But in the 44 years nearly he had as former president, he lived long enough to not only reinvent the role of former president, but to have the constancy of his character, which I think had always been the same, show through in his writing, in his work around the world, in his peacemaking, in his faith. All the things that he had been, for better and worse as president, he was able to show to their best advantage in these many years.
He was such an outsider, though, and I think just to remind people, and this is from your own writing, too, I mean, Democrats had enormous majorities at the time. I mean, the majority leader was Robert Byrd. Democrats had 61 seats in the Senate. Under Tip O'Neill, the margin was 150 seats. I mean, to think about Democrats controlled Washington, and yet Jimmy Carter's relationship with Tip O'Neill was tense, or you describe it.
They could not have been more different people. And as you say, the only politics in those days were politics within the Democratic bloc because the majorities were huge. And Democrats in those days assumed they would always naturally control the House. And so Carter, again, was a very different person from Tip O'Neill. He was not a machine politician. He had no national political experience. And so the same freshness and outsiderness that we remember from those days that made him so popular. I think he still has the highest popularity rating of any first-term president, in the time since then. Also meant he didn't really know all the ropes of dealing with Congress. And so that accounted both for his freshness and some of his difficulties, I think.
Jill, I think, if I could just add to that point, I think he ran a terrific campaign when you come right down to it. Saying, I will not lie to you after Watergate and what the country had gone through had been great. But he advertised himself to be someone who was an outsider, who was not part of the Washington establishment. And that was had a great deal to do with him being elected. Once he got to Washington, he turned out to be just what he had advertised himself to be, someone who was an outsider, who was not part of the establishment, and it really took him a while to get adjusted.
Hey, Jim, just real quick, what was President Carter like up close in the Oval Office? You were a speechwriter for President Carter. You worked with him closely. You saw Hamilton, Jordan, and Jody Powell and this tight-knit group around him, but you had entry into that inner circle as a speechwriter working on some major addresses. What was he like up close at the height of his power?
You all were talking recently about his autographing approach. I have lots of his autograph material. It usually says things like, do better, very poor, not funny enough. He was quite a demanding taskmaster. And so I think that people who worked for him respected him and had enormous admiration for his constancy and his fidelity and all the rest. But he was not an easy person to work for. I think one of the aphorisms was easier to admire than to work for, which may be the case with many strong leaders.
I think the word that has been used over and over again was his discipline, incredible discipline.
Discipline, and what Bob said, he really was honest. He lived up to his campaign, but he arrived in January of 1977 saying, the Democratic Party is an albatross around my neck. He wanted nothing really to do with Senator Ted Kennedy or with Scoop Jackson, and he jammed the Panama Canal Treaty right out of the gate, dividing Democrats. I interviewed Senator Talmadge down at his pond house down in Georgia, and Talmadge said, "Look, I love Carter. I'm the senator from Georgia, and I've known him forever. But what he did to Panama Canal to the Democratic Party is unforgivable."
And notable that Donald Trump today was talking about just that, someone who demands unity and loyalty.
I was in Panama very recently. Can I say, I actually view this as one of Carter's great achievements, that he was able, both diplomatically, these were negotiations that started under Richard Nixon, as you know, because of the security threat to Panama. And he got 68 votes in the Senate to do this, which was one of his great legislative achievements, I think. But yes, it had the effects you talked about.
A lot of the people who voted for it in the Senate got beat in the next election.
Jennings Randolph and others, yes.
Yeah.
John Dickerson is with us as well. John?
Hey, Jim. We've been talking about the team that existed in Washington, which is to say the Democrats. I want to ask you about the team he picked, which is to say his cabinet. Outsiders come into Washington, they're going to shake things up. He had this different view of existing Democrats, but he also had a different view about the way cabinets are arranged, and he was going to try and do it differently. Can you just tell that story briefly and how that contributed to his difficulty? This person who is quite interested in the details was trying to rewrite the way a cabinet works. Tell that story.
So John, you have told this story, and I will let you give the full version. But what struck me is two things about the cabinet. One is these were eminent people. You know, Cyrus Vance, who he chose over George Bull as Secretary of State, and he had the first Energy Secretary James Schlesinger and Ray Marshall as Labor Secretary, and a number of other eminent people. But Carter felt as if they should be, he should not be really taking counsel from them. The other, of course, as you know, John, really significant cabinet story was after Carter gave his famed 1979 crisis of confidence speech, it was wildly popular for about a week until he asked the entire cabinet for its resignation, and that was when sort of the long slide accelerated.
He worked hard to put a lot of women and African Americans into government. And there's a great story I just read about Jonathan Alter in his biography of President Carter was talking about how many federal judges that were women and African Americans that Carter had appointed.
To just build on Doug's point about President Carter's promotion of women and people of color, so much of that aspect of the Carter story comes back to his mother, Miss Lillian, a nurse down in Georgia who ministered to not only whites in Georgia, but to black Americans. And that example influenced Carter from an early age, and it influenced how he thought about race. So when you think about Carter in January 1971, telling Georgians the time for racial discrimination is over, stunning Georgia, but it didn't stun people who really knew Jimmy Carter, because his mother, along with his wife Rosalind, there was a side of compassion there on race for those who were struggling. And Carter's post-presidency, I would argue, deeply influenced by his own mother's example. Miss Lillian, as she was known, served in the Peace Corps.
At age 68.
68.
Yeah.
At age 68, going to India and elsewhere. It was this commitment to service, this commitment to diversity that coursed through the veins of Jimmy Carter, influenced by his mother, and it was forged again and again throughout his life.